I have a Southern Baptist background. I'm from the South. I'm from Mississippi. And so the issues that I write about and talk about are going to be those kinds of issues, the kinds of issues you would have from growing up in the South. And when I first started writing, I wasn't initially critiquing religion per se. I'm what I would call a conciliatory person. I call myself pathologically conciliatory. I do not like telling people things that will upset them at me. And I've had to learn to deal with things that people don't want to hear and say them, because I see people being hurt. And when you see people being hurt, it's time to speak up and say something. Just letting bygones be bygones doesn't always take care of the problem. Sometimes in order to build and construct something positive, you have to tear some things down that are harmful and that are in the way. So some of what I write about these days is critiquing religion, but I would not call myself an anti-theist. I would call myself an anti-fundamentalist. And the reason is that I don't have a problem with belief in God. I don't even have a problem with faith in and of itself. Some would argue we all have pieces of faith of different kinds. I'm not totally sure. It depends on how you define that. But I have seen fundamentalism and its kissing cousin, evangelicalism, cause harm in some people's life. And I speak about those things and I write about those things because I want to address the issues that are becoming harmful to some people's lives. And over the course of the last year or so that I've been publishing what I've been writing online, more people have begun to contact me and tell me their stories about what their experience has been. And the more I get in touch with them, the more I hear that harm is being done. And so I write about it and I speak up about it and I critique it. And then people from elsewhere will write me and say, why are you still writing about this? If you're not a Christian anymore, why do you write so much about Jesus? If you're not a theist, why do you write about God? You know, for somebody who's supposed to be an atheist, you sure talk about God a lot. And I want to tell them, you don't understand. I live in the South. Okay? Yeah, you understand this. If living in the South is like being in church all the time, everywhere you go. Yeah, a lot of nodding. That's because it's a part of our culture. It's a part of our vocabulary. It's thick in the air. And people who aren't from here don't get that. You know, I was writing something that was sort of critical of a belief system one day, and somebody wrote in and said, again, same spill, I don't know why you're writing so much about religion if you're not supposed to be a believer yourself. You know, why don't you just move on? Why don't you go live your life and ignore it? Just ignore it. It doesn't have to impact you. And I'm thinking, you have no idea what it's like to be in my life. And I went and looked up the guy's IP address, and he lives in Germany. And I got the same critique the next week from another guy living in Seattle. And he's like, you know what, you talk as if it's hard to be an atheist in the United States. And it's not. I've never had any trouble for the fact that I'm not a Christian. And again, I looked him up and he lives in Seattle. Well, that to me is like somebody in San Diego complaining that people in Seattle talk about rain too much. You know? Or maybe a guy sitting in a cubicle in an office space complaining that sailors complain about the weather too much. If you're not out here, if you're not where we are, you don't understand what it's like. So I asked for some suggestions from some friends to contribute to a little spill about what it's like being in the South. You might live in the Bible Belt if. Okay? So several of them sent in their suggestions. Some of them are funny and some of them are serious. And the text is tiny, so hopefully I can read this now. All right. You might live in the Bible Belt if there's a church for every 4 people and 2 in every strip mall, you might live in the Bible Belt. If your local public high school invites an area church to hold a mandatory evangelistic meeting on campus in the middle of the school day, you might live in the Bible Belt. That happened at the school next door to me, by the way. They got sued for that and they got sued by a Christian who said that's actually not the American way to do this, that you can't make it mandatory. But anyway, maybe for another talk. You know this one. If you move to a new area, the first question they ask you is, what line of work are you in? The second question they ask is, what church do you go to? Exactly. It's you can count on it. You can bank on it. The third question is usually about football. And like you care about local football and you just moved to the area. But anyway, it's always about where to go to church. And of course, if you say, I don't go to church, their response is, come to my church. You know, you'll love it there. All right. If they play only Christian music at your doctor's office, and your dentist's office, and at the auto shop, and at the gas station. And every clinic waiting room has either Bibles or tracts on the tables. You might live in the Bible Belt. If your bank has Bible verses scrolling across its marquee instead of interest rates. There's a chain in my city that's that way. If every employer you've had for the last 10 years has open staff meetings and meals with prayer and has Bible quotations in their email signature, you might live in the Bible Belt. If instead of goodbye, everyone tells you to have a blessed day. If instead of a tip, they leave you a fake $20 bill with the plan of salvation on the back. I bet you did that at some point, didn't you? I'm just kidding. All right. If you can't go to the local coffee shop without sitting next to people having a Bible study or an accountability group, you might live in the Bible Belt. If you can't buy liquor on Sundays because the liquor stores are closed, or, in fact, if you can't buy liquor at all in your county, you might live in the Bible Belt. If every private school in your area is run by a church and the public schools really aren't that different, you might live in the Bible Belt. If your whole community is up in arms about not being able to voice a Christian prayer at the start of football games, because that's the way we've always done it, you might live in the Bible Belt. If people around you feel that not being able to subjugate others to their beliefs infringes on their religious freedom, you might live in the Bible Belt. If people assume you share all their bigotries and speak to you in dog whistle language about all the people they hate. Actually, that's not just a Bible Belt thing, is it? And honestly, I should stop here and point out that the Bible Belt is not just one place. If you look at the statistics, the Bible Belt is really a subculture that's all over the country. It's really outside the United States too, but it's concentrated in the United States, and it's particularly concentrated in the Deep South. But if you go look at a map, the most evangelical and fundamentalist places are actually spread out all over the country. They're just generally aggregated away from the cities. But in the Deep South, even the cities are thick with this culture. It's just more concentrated. Anyway, if you see signs along the highway that say, "Who is Jesus?" even though 99% of your population already knows, you might live in the Bible Belt. If your public library carries books on spiritual warfare, but doesn't carry anything about Buddhism, Hinduism, or Islam, or humanism, you might live in the Bible Belt. If your congregation if your congressman refers to evolution and the Big Bang as lies straight from the pit of hell. You remember that, right? That was in Georgia, and that guy is actually on the science subcommittee for Congress. Lies from the pit of hell, he says. If you're surrounded by people who think evolution is a monkey giving birth to a human, you probably live in the Bible Belt, although, again, you could be in a lot of places. If every restaurant, sports bar, electronics store, or doctor's office with a TV has it set to Fox News, you might live in the Bible Belt. If you play a game on your drive to work called I Spy the Religious Vanity Plate and win every day, you might live in the Bible Belt. 3 words: Christian, roller, rink. And the reason I point this one out is this one was a personal one, but just a few minutes from my house, the only the only skating rink near me has Bible verses all over the floor, and they have them on the walls, and they play only Christian music as you skate around. That's Mississippi. If your governor states that anyone who opposes a personhood amendment works for the devil, my governor did that. You might live in the Bible Belt. If the Chief Justice of your state Supreme Court says that the First Amendment only protects Christians, that would be next door to y'all in Alabama. That was just last week. If most of the people who identify themselves as politically progressive build all of their arguments out of alternative interpretations of the Bible, think about that for a second. You might live in the Bible Belt. If homophobia is a viable political strategy in your district, you might live in the Bible Belt. And then finally, this is one I contributed. If God's Not Dead sells out 4 weekends in a row in your town, you might live in the Bible Belt. It did, at 4 weeks in a row, full, sold out. All right, now one more I want to add is that not everyone here would call themselves atheists or agnostics. There's a wide range of kind of humanists. And if you are not within the fold of evangelicalism, you've got to deal with the same sorts of problems as people who are in that fold. But it's even worse if you're more explicitly a non-theist, whether you call yourself atheist or agnostic. And for some reason, people get a lot more worked up about the word atheist than they do agnostic. It doesn't even always mean different things. It depends on how you define the words. And I have the hardest time making people understand that. But you may be godless in Dixie too. If you're a non-theist living in the South, you're godless in Dixie. I think we should have shirts that say, "I am godless in Dixie." Would you wear one of those? Probably. No, you wouldn't. No, you wouldn't. In public, you wear them in your house. Okay. You might be godless in Dixie if you find most of your real-life friends by making eye contact during group prayers. You might be godless in Dixie. If you identify as a non-Christian on your dating profile only to have 30 people start preaching and proselytizing you, you might be godless in Dixie. Although that came from a friend in Chicago, so once again, this is not just a Southern thing. If meeting up with other atheists is like joining a secret society, you might be godless in Dixie. If you have to join a secret group on Facebook in order to have a place where you can speak freely, you might be godless in Dixie. If you have to create a fake identity to avoid angering everyone in your entire family every single day on social media, you might be godless in Dixie. If you have to regularly tell people, "No, I don't worship Satan," you might be godless in Dixie. If people stop to read your bumper sticker and then immediately begin praying for you, yeah, this happens. If your car has been keyed as a result of a humanist or an evolution sticker, you might be godless in Dixie. And then finally, if people assume that being a humanist or an atheist means that you're also a communist, you probably live in the South. Okay, the last two are a little bit more serious. If you have to have a conversation with your elementary school child about weighing the dangers of being honest versus keeping his mouth shut in order to avoid being bullied by other children and the teacher, you might be godless in Dixie. And that's fresh out of the last week, by the way. If you worry about losing your job because your boss might find out that you don't believe in his religion, and his perception of you could suddenly flip like a switch, and he would assume that you were unethical and, quote, not a team player, and suddenly there are little nitpicky things that you do wrong he never noticed before, but now they are a huge problem for the company, you might be godless in Dixie. Okay, so y'all identify with some of these, or at least you're familiar with, if you've seen some people go through this. None of these are made up. These are pulled right out of regular daily life for somebody living in the South, and people who don't live here don't get it. And that's fine. I'm glad they have a different situation. I'm glad they can just be who they are, and they don't have to talk about what they're not. Even the word atheist is an annoying word because it's a negative word. It just says something about what you're not or what you don't believe. That defines you in terms of what somebody else believes, right? That's why I like the word humanist, because it actually is a positive statement of something that we believe in. We believe that people can actually do things that are worthwhile. And that's why we work on those things. And we don't use the same vocabulary, and that bugs people because you're not using the right code words. But many times you're actually after the same things, as long as it has to do with this world stuff. So what I want to talk about with what's remaining of my time is how to be godless in Dixie. Okay? How does one handle this situation in a way that's productive, individually and as a group? And then I'm also going to talk about how not to be godless in Dixie. So 4 things for each one. Number 1, how to be godless in Dixie. It depends on your situation. If you happen to live in a fundamentalist culture, my response is going to be different. And I know for a lot of you guys here, that might not be an issue, but there's going to be other people listening to this eventually if we can make it work and put it up online. And this is a lifeline for them when there are people that get together and talk about these things, because they don't have anything like that. They don't have any place they can go. And this is new for y'all too, right? To have a humanist group where you can get together with people and talk about these things. A lot of people don't have anything like that. My advice to them that are in a situation where they're surrounded by more of a hardcore fundamentalist situation is zip it. Just keep it to yourself. That's my first advice. I don't know how y'all feel about that, and I'm going to get to the opposite of that in just a minute, but I hear from a lot of people who are still young. They're still in their early 20s or maybe even in their teens, and they live with their families still, and their families are very hardcore fundamentalist or strong evangelicals, and to me, that's a spectrum that it's not always easy to distinguish. I would argue that an evangelical and a fundamentalist really believe exactly the same things. I often say that an evangelical is a fundamentalist with a better haircut, because it's really a stylistic difference. I defy you to find something a fundamentalist believes that an evangelical does not. It's just two different words for the same set of beliefs worked out in slightly different ways and a slightly different vocabulary. Where I'm from, fundamentalism isn't as common. That's kind of a rural situation. That's a rural context. But I'm from a city, and we're more sophisticated, so we're evangelicals. But some of the same issues creep up. And I would say that if you're young, or you're financially dependent upon those fundamentalists that are close to you, I wouldn't talk about it. I just wouldn't. And the reason is, it's going to bring out a side of them that is really scary. I mean, that's my experience, is that the people that I talk to say they were so nice and so welcoming and so kind about so many things. I've never seen this side to them before. That's because you've always been on the inside. And they can be really nice when you're on the inside, but once you're on the outside, your non-belief is now threatening to them. It scares them, both for themselves and for you. It scares them for themselves because if someone this close to them can stop believing, then they might stop believing too, and that scares them. And it also scares them for you because they're afraid something bad's going to happen to you now. Number one, you're going to have a terrible life, because that's the narrative I was told. If you don't follow this path, everything's going to go wrong for you. And the really sad thing about that is that if enough people around you believe that, they can begin mistreating you because they think that's what they're supposed to do. It's bold love. It's tough love. They could actually cut you off, and they could marginalize you and put a distance between them and you in various ways that hurt you, but they think they're helping you. They think what they're doing is disciplining you. You know, the Lord disciplines those whom He loves, the Bible says, and they'll take that, and they'll see that as what they're doing. They don't realize they're driving you away. But my advice to folks that are in that situation, if they're kind of stuck there and that's all they've got is their environment, I would just say zip it. Just don't talk about it. But that's only the first step. Second thing I would suggest is find ways to connect with people with whom you can identify. And there's a lot of ways to do that now. You might not have something like this where you have a real life group to meet up with, but you can always connect online. And even if you have to create an alias, create a fake identity. I probably have 5 or 6 dozen friends who are using fake names on the internet, and it's not to be a perv. Well, it depends, actually. I can think of a couple of them that are. But they're doing it because they want to be able to speak freely with their friends, and they want to be able to vent and talk about things without their family seeing the little ticker over on the right where all of their comments are showing up. And all kinds of personal drama can come from this situation, and that's why a lot of people have to create a fake identity, which is really sad when you think about it. I don't know if any of y'all saw that Lone Ranger movie that came out recently. It was kind of lame, by the way. You didn't miss anything. But there was one really good line where Johnny Depp's really bad example of a Native American character said, sometimes Kemosabe, a good man, has to wear a mask. And I think that's what's going on with a lot of folks. It's not that they're doing anything wrong. They're just trying to be themselves, but they can't be themselves where they are. So my advice is, number one, zip it when you're around those folks. Number two, find a way to connect with other people you can identify with, even if you have to create a fake identity. Find a place where you can vent about your issues, because doing it alone is going to be harmful to you. And to be honest, I'm speaking out of experience for that. The way that I dealt with it was I bottled it up and I kept it to myself. I didn't have anybody to talk to. When I was trying to work through my own intellectual issues, there weren't any books that meant anything to me. There weren't people that led me in one direction or another. It was just something I processed myself. I didn't have anybody to talk to, and I should have tried to find people to talk to, but I couldn't think of anybody at the time. This was just a year or two before I was able to even find networks online where people were connecting like that. So find people to connect with online. Even if that means you feel like you're leading a double life, at least somewhere there's a place where you can be yourself and you have an outlet and you can share and vent, and you might hear some advice from them that's very helpful. Third thing I would suggest is to read. If you're in that situation, read as much as you can. Feed your mind. Put yourself in situations where you can get a hold of articles and books that'll feed your mind. Science stuff comes out every week. There's some new scientific discovery that just makes you tingle because it's so amazing. This is a great time to be alive if you have any scientific curiosity at all. There's these little infographics that go around once every month or once every week even that have like 5 things that were discovered in science just this week. It's really amazing. So I would read and feed your mind. Read philosophical stuff. Read scientific stuff. Read artistic stuff. Read some really good poetry. Find a way to expand your horizons and connect with as many people that way as you can. Because once you're reading stuff that other people are reading, now you've got another connection point with more people. Okay, so then the last thing I would suggest is, if you're in a situation where you're independent and you're not so connected to very rigid, ideologically rigid people that you can come out and tell people that you're a humanist, an atheist, an agnostic, whatever, please come out and tell people that you are. It may feel like a strange thing to do, and a lot of people resist that. And I know why you do, because the kind of people who gravitate away from the prevailing culture of their environment tend to be nonconformist in personality, right? They do. There tends to be a larger concentration of nonconformists among groups like humanists, atheists, agnostics. And so they don't like being in groups, It's like somebody says, it's like trying to get a bunch of agnostics to do something together is like herding cats. Because their whole point is they're independent spirits. It's really hard to get them to do things together. But it's useful. It's helpful. People need it. We need the strengths from each other's numbers. And so you should come out, if not just for your own benefit, to make yourself more at home in your own life. But it helps other people too, which I'm going to get to in just a second. That's more of a group benefit. So if you can, I would say come out. If you're in a highly fundamentalist, hardcore situation, I'd say don't. But if you're fairly independent and that's not the world you're in, do us all a favor and tell people what you are. It's going to help the rest of us. Some of the people who went through the gay and lesbian movement that started in the 70s have said that one of the greatest things that helped that movement was just the simple act of stepping out and saying what you were. Just identifying yourself makes a huge difference. Because people have a preconceived notion of what that type person is like. And every new person that steps forward and says, I'm one of those, it's going to change their perception, right? It's going to break a stereotype. It's going to at least nuance it to some degree. Now we have a professional football player that's openly gay. And it's going to change things for non-believers as well, for people who have fine, upstanding lives, who are productive citizens that step out and say, you know what, I'm actually a normal person and I'm just not a Christian. It's okay. It'll help undemonize the label. All right. As a group, what can be done? Because it's not just about you individually, but what can make our circumstance better for people like me living in Mississippi, who's not a believer? I would say, number one, you coming out. That's the first thing. I have 1 foot out and 1 foot in. I'm kind of in a complicated situation. Not everybody around me knows. So I'm out and I'm in at the same time. But I would say, if you can, come out, because it helps everyone. Second thing I would say is, we need to continue rallying around the separation of church and state problem. One of the beautiful things about the fabric of this country is that we had the idea of having a secular government so that sectarian religious ideas would not dictate what the government does. Because there's no way to keep those from becoming skewed one way or another. It just kind of follows the whim of whichever religion it is. And even the religious people at the beginning of our country understood that they didn't want other people telling them they couldn't be whatever form of religion they were. In case you didn't know this, by the way, there were two competing mentalities at the beginning of our country. One mentality was that idea that we should separate church and state so that religious ideology would not dictate what the government does. Because every time that's happened in the past, it blended two things that don't blend very well. They just don't. Actually, both things suffer. When church and state are mixed, they both suffer. The church becomes corrupted by the power and the money of it all, besides the fact that making one denomination or one sectarian group the official group hurts all the rest of them. But it also messes up the government. So it's good for both to keep them separate. But there was another mentality at that time, and Patrick Henry is a good example of that mentality. He believed that there should be an official state religion. So that idea was always around, and it's still around with us today. You'll notice that there's people that you might work with or go to school with, and you hear them saying the same sort of thing. And we've got to continue fighting that. And when I say fighting that, I don't mean just talking about it, but you eventually have to do court at some point or another. People like me, we don't like fights. Like I said, I'm a pathologically conciliatory person. But sometimes you have to go to court on these things. People don't give up positions of privilege or power willingly. And there's a thing called privilege blindness, where you don't even notice that you're privileged. But trust me, I'm a straight white male. I know what privilege looks like, And I've also seen what it's like to go from having it to not having it. because now I'm sort of outside the camp since enough people around me know that I'm not a Christian anymore. I've seen what it looks like to lose privilege, and it's no fun, but I've also seen that you don't know it when you've got it. It's called privilege blindness. It makes you unable to see the suffering of people who don't have your privilege. And people don't give that up willingly, because number one, they don't even know they have it. And number two, think about it. Who's going to willingly give up power? You're going to appeal to their moral sense, and they're going to give it up? No, that's not the way it works. Sometimes, and we're from the South, we know this. Sometimes the only way to make sure people get equal treatment is you got to go to court. Okay, another thing I would suggest is to organize, which is what you guys have done. All right, that's one of the things that you guys don't need me to tell you to do. But to actually take the step of organizing so that you can do things and take on projects. You can raise funds for things, and you can try to do something and even put the name humanist on it so that there's some visibility to what you're doing. That's one of the ways that you change the perception of what a humanist is, or an atheist, or an agnostic, or whatever. These things are actually helpful, even if they feel a little weird to do them. You know, there's this tendency to want to do things and to not put any label on it, because, we just do it because we want to. We're just people. People want to do things to help each other. But for the rest of us, we could use you going on and telling people, you know what, the Humanist Association, or the Humanist Assembly is doing this for you. That's a helpful thing. It helps identify a group of people that do good things for the world, and it changes the perception of what a humanist is. Promote science and learning and education where you are, because around here, a lot of people actually resist those things. You're aware of this. The more the world gets connected, the more it breaks the bubble of provinciality. And there are things that we can do to help push for technological advances where we are, push for medicine research, push for better technology in our schools, push for better biology education in our schools. Take an active interest in those things, because it helps break that rigid mentality, that provincial mentality that's in an area. And I think a group like this, the more you pool your resources, the more something like that can be done. Attention can be brought to these problems, and things can be done to try to push that envelope a little bit and open up the Southern mind to some new things. Okay. All right, so a couple of last things I want to point out. How not to be godless in Dixie. This is probably not for you guys, because what I find is people who are drawn to humanism tend to be nicer. They just are. There's just a tendency to want to be positive. But a lot of folks who are out there that are drawn towards something called not something. Atheism it means not theism. Sometimes they're just contrarian by nature. And there's a lot of jerks out there, just to be honest, by nature. Christians have them too, unfortunately. And some of them even become leaders. But they're out there. And there's less of a tendency to try to stifle that out in a free thought community. So my first advice is how not to be godless in Dixie. Don't be a jerk. If you're one of those people, unfortunately, they're never self-aware. But here's my way of knowing if you're a jerk. If everyone around you is always too sensitive, that's probably a good sign that you're a jerk. Because everyone else is always upset with you, but it's never your fault. You're probably a jerk. I'm just guessing. It's one of those things they say, the only consistent factor in all of your problems is you. If everyone around you is always too sensitive, there's a good chance you're a jerk. Just kind of tone it down a little bit. Think before you speak. There's a good chance that you say things that hurt people, and you're not helping the rest of us when you act like a jerk. And it happens a lot online. There are some serious jerks online. They get on there, and all they do is they just tear into everybody else. Find something constructive to talk about. Even I spend time critiquing religion, but I try to find something that's an agreement between us, and I'm not going to act like a jerk about it. Second thing not to do is don't forget to pick your battles. You don't have to make everything a battle. You know, like I know somebody that really struggles over what they should say when somebody sneezes. You know, it's okay if you want to say bless you. It's okay. You know, it's not like when somebody sneezes you have to say, there is no God. You know? There's people who are actually that way. They have nothing is small. Everything's a mountain, not a molehill. So don't do that. Another thing, do your homework. If you're going to be arguing or critiquing somebody else's belief, don't just start slamming it without doing your homework and figuring out what it is that they really believe. Recently, we got in a discussion about the whole shellfish and mixed fabric argument about homosexuality. I don't know if you've heard this, but like every time somebody wants to say, we know the Bible says that it's not okay to be homosexual, they say, well, you know, it also says that you can't have shellfish or mixed fabrics, you might not understand that there's more of a nuanced perspective for most Christians on that. And if you've never been an evangelical Christian yourself, you might not understand what the nuance is of that. There's a development of thought in the Bible, and if you're unaware of it, I understand you feel there's inconsistencies. I do too. But do your homework and learn a little bit more about what you're critiquing before you go out there and start misrepresenting the rest of us. Or if you see a meme passed around that says Jesus was just copying Horace, that happens every Easter and Christmas, and people just pass along information that's interesting to them without checking into it. Do your homework. Check into stuff. Don't forward stuff before you check it out first. I did that just this week. I forwarded something. It turns out it was a parody. You ever do that? You ever forward a news report? Turns out it was a parody site. Hate it when that happens. But just dig into it a little bit and do a little bit of research. By the way, The Onion and the Daily Current, make sure you know those are parodies. And I've discovered like 5 new ones over the last couple of weeks. Last thing I want to say is, in your efforts to restore the wall of separation between church and state, in your efforts to restore the freedoms that people are supposed to have who are not believers or who are not evangelical believers, don't make the opposite mistake of limiting other people's freedoms. And some people make this mistake. In order for a non-believer to freely be a non-believer, they don't have to prevent everyone else from being a believer. Now, it sounds a little bit like a straw man because most people are not really out for that. That's actually what people who are evangelical Christians think I'm out for. They think I'm out to get rid of all faith and all belief. I'm really not. I promise I'm not. I don't think that's even possible, to be honest. I think it's wired into human nature to look for something bigger than himself or herself. I have my own interpretations of what I do with that. But in my effort to reestablish freedom of non-religion, freedom from religion, I don't want to limit other people's freedom for religion. So don't overdo it, okay? Because whenever somebody does that, it adds fuel to the fire when other people say that's what we're doing. And I'm trying to say that's not what we're doing, but there's some people who are doing that. So don't do that. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, that was the last thing I was going to share. And if I have a couple more minutes, I was going to see if there's any questions and answers, because I think y'all do that sometimes, right?